morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's wonderful to see you all here this morning. My name is David Stewart. I'm the Director of Libraries here at Bethel, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to this event when we will be honoring some of our best research this year. Eric Gossett, the president of our Friends of the Library group, is going to take over the next part of the program. But again, welcome and thank you for joining us for this important event.
Before I get into actually introducing the students who have won these prizes, we have a special gift to the Friends of the Library I'd like to give. Over a number of years when we've been doing these primetime presentations, Bob Kistler has been running the video camera and putting the videos up on the Bethel web, kind of just out of the kindness of his heart. So we thought we would give him a little gift bag. Come up here, Bob. And some anonymous contents, but also a live orchid in, notice it hasn't been snipped. And we're also making a contribution for a little community garden associated with the Frogtown Summit neighborhood that's attached to Bethel. Bob's an avid gardener. Thanks. Well, this year we had a record number of entries in our Library Research Prize contest and some really, really good stuff. And so we kind of went out of our way to say we gave more prizes than we had intended because we just couldn't leave all of these good things unrecognized. But before I recognize those, we do have a scholarship that the library staff give to one of their student workers. And I mean,
in 2009, the Friends organization established an annual $300 scholarship in memory of Connie J. Larson, reference librarian, in commemoration of her service to the Bethel University Library and in celebration of her dedication to the training, supervision, and development of student library assistants. This scholarship is awarded each year to a student serving in the, or working in the Bethel University Library who exemplifies an attitude of service. The 2013-2014 recipient of the Connie J. Larson Memorial Scholarship Award is Joseph Dreschel. And Joe's supervisor would like to share with you some of the reasons why he was nominated and selected to receive this award.
I was delighted to recommend Joe Dreschel for the Friends of the Library Bethel University Library Connie J. Larson Memorial Scholarship Award. He is certainly deserving of this award. Joe was working in the audio-visual department at an unusually challenging time for AV. The AV supervisor left her position to pursue work in the area of her master's degree. That gave us the opportunity to rethink how AV could look. We knew that AV departments in other academic libraries were being reshaped as media needs were changing. It was decided that we would follow a similar path ourselves. Thus, there has been a transition time in AV during the school year. Joe has been instrumental in the success of this transition. Joe participated in meetings with David Stewart, Carol Craig, and myself, where we planned the transition strategy of each phase. During each transition, Joe's opinion was sought and valued. Because of Joe's leadership, wisdom, ability to strategize and to communicate well, he was promoted to a student supervisor. Joe displays a warm, yet firm interaction style when working with the AV students. He has poise that engenders trust, and the students like and respect him. The AV transition would have had many more bumps along the way if not for Joe's excellent supervision and leadership at this challenging time. Joe received a unanimous nomination from the Bethel University Library staff for this award. Way to go, Joe.
Let me make two quick announcements and then we'll start handing out the awards. Right after the first place winner gives her talk, we will have the department heads of last year's winner and this year's winner come up and exchange our prestigious Library Research Award. Really kind of cool little statue, and we'll have that. And that'll be done in time for everyone to make it to class. And then afterwards, if you're a member of the Friends of the Bethel Library, if you could stay around for a 10 to 15 minute annual meeting of the Friends of the Library. We'll have our annual elections for officers and our financial report. Okay, I would like to now introduce the students who were involved in this. Each one will receive a really cool looking certificate.
Oh, wow.
And a little nice cooler looking check. So we had part of the Research Prize Award was not only to present the paper that you've written for a class that used the library in significant ways, but also to write an essay documenting how the library was used and how that was helpful. And one of those essays was so good we gave a special award this year to Shane Sunholm for the best essay on how he used the library services. Shane, if you could walk up here, that would be great. He was working with Professor Yim, and I saw him. You could just sit out there. And why don't you just hang on for a second. We also have a third prize winner for the Research Prize, Brendan Rosas. If you would come up. He submitted a paper called The Truth Behind the Tale, How Real-Life Love Stories Really Begin, working with Professor McNeil, who is also here. Our second place winner was Sarah Miskin. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Miskin. Okay, and her paper was, actually, The Love That Overcomes Jürgen Moltmann and Nonviolent Atonement is her paper, and she was working with Dr. Eddy and...
At a department meeting.
He's at a department. He chose a department meeting. I bet he would prefer to be here. Thank you all, and you may have a seat. Please congratulate the ladies. Our first place winner this year is Matisse Murray, who wrote Trees Nestled Among Skyscrapers, Frederick Olmsted, and the Creation of Central Park, working with Professor Koistra, who's sitting way in the back there. So, Matisse.
Thank you, Dr. Gossett. Hello and welcome. I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I was just telling some of you with whom I was talking before the program started how happy I am to see everyone, especially today, given the fact that I have just recently started, or I'm ending my student teaching experience, and so it's very good to see everyone at Bethel again, to be able to come back for this and to revisit some scholarship that I engaged in last semester. Now, as you can perhaps tell, the podium is to the side as opposed to the way that it usually is positioned, and I've become accustomed to teaching and walking around, and so the podium will be over here, so I'm not hiding behind it. So forgive me if I'm flailing my hands everywhere. It's unfortunately an outgrowth of the past 2 months. So I'll get this set up here. And I have even learned how to work these projectors over the course of the last semester. So, this project, this paper was regarded as it was my senior seminar paper for this past semester, and this was done under the advisorship of Professor Anne-Marie Koistra. So it's good to see you. Thank you for all your assistance. She was a sounding board for me, an excellent one, helping me in sorting through all the various topics that I threw at her. So, and it was a bit of an arduous process, trying to determine what kind of topic I wanted to pursue. And I had a wide range of things that I could have talked about. And somehow I landed upon looking at Central Park and looking at Frederick Olmsted and looking into almost a branch of environmental history to an extent, and social history and urban history, branches of history that I never even considered exploring before. And so this project is an outgrowth of several experiences that I had last summer and then also last fall semester. There's really a meeting here of the trip, a vacation that my parents and my family and I went on last summer, as well as a 19th century American history class that I took with Dr. Magnuson that same semester. So my presentation, my paper surrounded exploring Central Park and exploring more specifically how one of the designers, Frederick Olmsted, approached the park and the ways in which, what his vision was for what the park should look like and the way that it ought to influence others. And the reason that I chose this topic, one of the reasons that I believe that I found this so fascinating, is last summer, my family and I went to New York City, and we had a crazy early flight, very early flight. And when we arrived in New York City, we wanted to stay up for the entire day so that we wouldn't get all crazy with our sleep schedule. And so the beginning of our first day, by the time that we had landed in LaGuardia, gone on a very interesting taxi ride to Manhattan, over to Midtown, we were exhausted. And later on that day, in order to keep us awake, in order to help us recover from the strain, shall we say, of the travel, we ended up going to Central Park. And my mom suggested, let's go to the park, let's walk around. And it was wonderful. It was a beautiful refreshment, a beautiful, refreshing experience that we had that afternoon. And so one of the things that, when I was thinking about senior seminar, that I decided to explore was how in the world something this natural, this beautifully natural, could also look this artificial. Now, I was never in a helicopter above the city, and I never actually got to see Central Park from the air, but if you look at it, and I apologize for the resolution of this picture, but if you look at it, it is incredibly artificial looking from the air. It is quite literally a rectangle of green from the air, planted right in the middle of a city, which, as we know, New York, one of the most urban-like cities that you can imagine, huge, skyscrapers everywhere. And so one of the things that I ended up exploring was how in the world something that artificial looking could be utterly so natural at the same time. And actually, at first I was going to be looking at the aesthetics of Central Park and the ways in which the park design exemplified different visions regarding aesthetics and the environmental aspect of it. What I ended up looking at was more of the social aspect of it, and looking rather at what Frederick Olmsted wished to accomplish socially. So I ended up looking at what were Olmsted's social motivations, what governed his vision of the park, what kind of vision did he have for Americans, and how was that demonstrated in the park itself. And so what I ended up focusing on, as a result of my scholarship, was I was seeing competing impulses in Olmsted's work, one of which was one that seemed to have a very democratic character, the sense of the park being a democratic institution in which everyone, all Americans, could come and enjoy. And the other impulse that I was seeing in his work was a strong sense of elitism, more of an aristocratic spirit that was had a very distinct vision of how people ought to be affected and what kinds of people would be enjoying the park and how. So there were two very different competing impulses in his work, and those are the two that I try to reconcile throughout my work. Now, part of the requirement for this paper was to examine the historiography, or the ways in which the history of Central Park has been treated. How have people been looking at Frederick Olmsted? How have they been studying his work? And how have they been looking at his vision for the park? How have they characterized that in their writings? And so I looked at that specifically, and I saw three main waves pop up. Now, the interesting thing is that in 1972, this is the sesquicentennial of Olmsted's birth, and this marks a renewal of interest in Olmsted's life and also in his work. And for those of you who remember, who have ever been to Central Park, or who knew about Central Park and as it was in the 70s, you will know that it was very different from the way that Olmsted originally envisioned it. So, in 1977, the first volume of what are known as the Frederick Olmsted Papers are published. And these were invaluable to my research, and actually, Erlene, I believe that it was you who helped me order all of those. Originally, I saw one entry in the library, and I thought, oh, that's great, I'll just order those. Turns out there are 7 volumes, ranging from this thick to this thick. So I had quite a few books in my bookshelf over the course of the semester. But these papers marked the mainstay of the research of the first wave, what I'll call the first wave of biographers of Olmsted. One in particular, Laura Wood Roper, who publishes her biography of Olmsted in 1977. And this first wave of scholarship, this initial renewal in Olmsted's life, has a very flattering view of him. And it is very much emphasizing the democratic aspect of the park, the democratic element of the park, wherein everyone is welcome. It's intended as an institution that everyone can enjoy. And that is really the way that she frames Central Park, the way that she frames Olmsted's life, is this desire to provide a very democratic institution for all of Americans. And so again, in the early 1970s. Now, later on, this is not much later, but in the late 70s into the 80s, this scholarship shifts, and actually quite a bit. So if you read some of Laura Wood's Roper work, and then if you shift over to an article I found by Jeffrey Blodgett, they're very different in terms of the way that they describe Olmsted's work. And Jeffrey Blodgett much more references Olmsted's love of gentility. Olmsted, as I saw in my research, very much appreciated the genteel class. The genteel classes, the middle classes, the upper middle classes, and the kind of lifestyle and the kind of manners that that class demonstrated. And this, you see this in the park. And so one thing that Blodgett points out is that this inclusiveness that Olmsted has in the park actually kind of has an ulterior motive, in that this was actually meant as a civilizing institution for people. And so there's an elitist element there too. And that is the emphasis that's in the second wave of scholarship. This more conservative view of Olmsted's work. This third one goes into the 90s, and this one is a little bit more balanced, and this is the vein in which my research followed. And it's a little bit more, I would say, nuanced, because it takes into account the inclusiveness of the park and the democratic element of Olmsted's work, and yet it also acknowledges the fact that, yes, Olmsted very much had this appreciation of gentility, and he very much had this desire for people to all rise up to this same level of the ability to enjoy this park in a certain way. And so it's a much more balanced. It still accounts for the democratic inclusiveness of the park, but it also takes into account the elitism that also characterizes the park, and very much so. What I eventually settled upon, or what I eventually attempted to argue in my paper, was that in order to reconcile this democratic and this aristocratic impulse, I put it under the umbrella of a Republican vision, meaning that Olmsted's vision was characterized by an openness that classical republicanism engenders, that there is a sense of people can all come, and yet there is definitely an educative element to this as well. Okay, so there's a quote here that Central Park is a very significant democratic institution, Olmsted says. And yet at the same time, the progression of art and culture in this country is significantly dependent upon it. And so there is the sense that there is this inclusivity, but then there's also an elitism as to who can enjoy the park and how one should enjoy the park. And so the way that I tried to illustrate this was that I tried to use 3 points of synthesis. And that is to show that the park not only included physical refreshment, but it also was intended to socially uplift people. It was intended to be accessible to other people, and yet there was also supposed to be an educative element to it. People were meant to be affected and influenced by their time in the park. And finally, everyone, again, was to be included. This was a public park. Everyone could come, and yet there would be a park keeper force. There would be an oversight by a small group of people who would ensure that the park was being enjoyed properly. So it's a very balanced approach that I'm taking, influenced by, and this is rather small down here in the right-hand corner, but these tenets of classical republicanism, in that the country assumes that its citizens are going to be politically active, and therefore citizens have an obligation to be educated and to be aware of the issues that are surrounding the country. And so classical republicanism, there are these emphases on civic duty, a duty of people to help others, especially those who have, to those who have not. So a sense of obligation. Also, a sense of freedom. There is liberty. But then how do we balance that with education, how people should be? Okay. And then also the sense of expertise, of a small group of people overseeing the way that the rest of the country functions. Now, in order to fully understand the park, there are a few contextual things that need to be understood about Olmsted's life. And one is that Olmsted grew up in an environment of middle class, a middle class environment, upper middle class environment actually. He constantly enjoyed financial security throughout his life. And so you really see that when he has this, there's this emphasis on the genteel classes, and that is the class in which he was brought up. And that is what he felt the rest of the country ought to aspire to. And so we see that in his own life. He also has a very eclectic education. And he really, he has I think I say in my paper, New England appreciation of education and of that experience for people. And his father loved scenery. You see young Olmsted, even when he's very little, appreciating scenery and going out and really feeling like, ultimately feeling that landscape can be an element or a medium through which education can take place. So using nature as a way to educate people. He also does some extensive reading. Thomas Carlyle and Andrew Jackson Downing are two people who especially influence his view that landscape can indeed be a medium of improvement for the masses, as well as the fact that he was also keenly aware of the impact of cities. And one of the things that I find so interesting about this topic is that it really is, it represents an intersection of various elements of 19th century America, one of which is the urban explosion that's going on during this time. We're talking about the mid-1850s, late 1850s. And so he was aware of the social ills of the urban environment. And so, being aware of that, he also views the park as having a curative effect, having health benefits for the country as well. And so he's aware of this, and he brings that into the park design. Also, Olmsted he's an English family. His family has English heritage. And during the 1850s, he returns to England to go visit his family's home. And while he's there, while he's in Liverpool, he visits a nearby park. It's called Birkenhead Park, and he is enthralled with this park. And one of the things that he says is he calls it a people's garden. And he's thrilled with the fact that this is a public park that everyone can come to and everyone is welcome to. And I was researching this. I was looking at the Central Park Conservancy website this week, and actually the head of the Conservancy returned to Birkenhead Park just this month and went back to Birkenhead and said, you can feel Central Park in Birkenhead. You can completely feel the influence that he had. And this influences almost not only in terms of the design of the park, but also in terms of the fact that this is a public institution for everyone to have access to. So this really impacts the way that Olmsted sees the potential for parks, the potential that they could have, the influence that they could have on other people. Olmsted takes a trip to the South. He becomes a journalist. He has many different occupations before he settles upon being the designer of Central Park. And everything from seafaring to a journalist to farming. And while he's a journalist, he goes to the South. And one of the things that troubles him is the presence of slavery. But he also, one of the things that he struggles with is, with this appreciation of gentility, he wonders if the South, the gentlemen of the South, whether that kind of gentility can be found in the North. When you don't have an aristocracy, when you have a free labor ideal, when you have a greater sense of egalitarianism in the North, can we attain that level of gentility that the South has with its gentle class? And that's something that troubles him, actually. And so in a way, Central Park is his defense of that. That yes, indeed, we can have, people are capable of being uplifted to this cultured state. And you can do that in a society where there is no aristocracy. Here's just a sense of a timeline that is rather difficult to see. But as you can see, we're in the 1850s. Now, Olmsted, the actual park, the proposal for the park, and that has a history all on its own, a very political one. And the park is proposed in 1851. But it's not actually completed until 1873. And Olmsted's actually, even though he had such a vast influence on the park, he's only involved really for a couple of years. And he and Calvert Vaux, or Vaux, depending upon your choice, he is actually the one, he's also a landscape designer, he is the one who actually convinces Olmsted to join him in designing the park. And they enter a competition in 1857, and they win. They win the design competition for the park. And so they're involved for the next couple of years working on creating this pleasure ground for people. And what's interesting is that it was very much even though it was intended to be completely natural, the process by which it was created was intensely artificial. And there's a quote by Henry David Thoreau that actually he came and said, "Oh, thank goodness, they left it alone a lot more than I thought they would." Even though technically, I found in one of my books there was a quote that said that more gunpowder was used to clear the soil from the park than was used in all of the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. They literally moved mountains. They literally moved heaven and earth to create this thing. And it took a while. But Olmsted is really only involved in the design for the first couple of years. And yet, he has a huge impact on the way that the park is designed and the way that it's viewed. So, as I referenced before, I broke this down into 3 points of synthesis to divide this very complex idea into three specific competing impulses in Olmsted's work. And one is this concept of civic duty, this idea that the upper class, the middle class, has an obligation to serve and to uplift to help members of the lower classes. And we see two competing impulses here again. We see this emphasis on physical refreshment, that everyone needs to come to be physically refreshed and simply relax, and this sense of education. People need to come there to be educated on how to be and how to be gentle people. Okay. So, physical refreshment, here's the first one, and this one is very clear. And this one is deeply rooted in Olmsted's view of cities themselves, because Olmsted sees, it's interesting, he loves yeomanry, he loves this idea of a country farmer, and that way he's very much a Jeffersonian. But he is also keenly aware of the fact that cities are not going anywhere, that cities are very much the future of the American landscape, and that there is no going back. And so he sees the cities as key to the development of the national character. And so one of the things that he does with this park, he sees parks as a way to provide a curative effect, an antidote, if you will, to the cities. He's vastly aware of the physical ills that plague the cities, the lack of ventilation, the lack of green, the lack of sunlight that plagues the cities, and he feels that green space, having lungs for the city through a park, incorporating nature into the park is huge for having a successful city, a successful urban environment. And so those without recourse to the country, so those who are here we see his concern for the lower classes, those who don't have a country place to go to, who don't have family, who live out of the city, who are stuck in the city, they have a place within the urban environment to go to attend, and to be refreshed in. So he's aware of this, and he sees that physical refreshment is a very significant reason for the park's existence. At the same time, he's also concerned, he's vastly concerned with the urban environment's psychological impact. So it's not just about the physical impact of not having enough breathing room or not having enough sunlight. It's also very much the artificiality of city life. And Olmsted, as a lover of scenery, is disturbed by the fact that there is so little room for nature and for the natural. And he's disturbed by the artificiality of the city, and especially New York City, where the grid system, the way that the city is laid out, and if you look at it, it's wonderfully ordered, and it's almost impossible to get lost in Manhattan because it's perfectly parallel and perpendicular lines. And yet, it's intensely artificial. And that's something that Olmsted is concerned with. And so what he's concerned about is that the park can provide a break from that, a break from this artificial city environment. And that by virtue of the harmonious composition of the park, the way that all the natural elements work together, that this will promote physical refreshment, and that this will help people to experience this sense of social and psychological uplift. There we go. The second point of synthesis that I addressed is this role of education. And to what extent do we allow people to be as they are? And do we respect people's sovereignty to be as they are and to live as they will and in their circumstances? And to what degree do we intend to educate people? Do we try to educate them and to lift them up to a specific type of being? And so one of the things that Olmsted's concerned about, he's very concerned that people can come to the park. So there is no restriction. You have to be this type of person to enter Central Park. There are no gates at night to be closed. There are some fences, but there are no gates. There's nothing to close off the park. It's not closed at night. It is intended to be a people's garden. And so people are supposed to come from all sorts of areas. And he's very concerned that people are able to access the park, that people are able to navigate it easily, that people are able to come. The location of the park is technically in the center of the island. Now, it's intended to be symbolically a democratic symbol. It's supposed to be a democratic location of being in the center of the island and not in any particular area. However, what ends up happening is that is technically where the upper classes are, and it's in part intended to boost property values. However, symbolically, it's meant to be a very accessible location in the center of Manhattan. And people are not intended to come there and to be quite literally taught the way that they should behave or the way that they should be. Instead, they are to be influenced. There's the sense of the park washing over you in a sense. It's meant to be an immersive experience. And that's the way the park is meant to influence you. So there is this sense of influence, but it's not meant to be completely explicit. Now here again, and this is something that I continue to refer back to in my paper, and that is this concern with education. And Olmsted, again, greatly admired this sense of gentility, and he really felt that in order America would truly be successful, really felt that America ought to be a class, a nation of gentle people, of gentlemen and gentlewomen. and that parks could be a way for that to happen. And so this park is meant to, he calls it a persistent influence, a charm, a kind of charm over the person. So again, this immersive experience. But then again, it's not simply intended to be physically refreshing, it's meant to be morally and socially uplifting, to this sense of gentility. Also, not only is the natural, the landscape meant to be the way in which this should take place, but also the fact that everyone is there, the fact that this is an inclusive park, should mean that people from a variety of classes are coming together, and that then there's this mingling. If you've ever been to Central Park and you know the long promenade, it's the only linear space in the park, quite literally. And it's this long stretch of beautiful American elms. And actually, one of the things that Olmsted was concerned with is that it would be too linear, and it would look too artificial. But one of the things that he liked about this is that it would be akin to the Champs-Élysées, he says, in Paris, where people are coming and mingling together. So you have the upper class, you have the working class, you have all these people coming together, and when they are together, there's meant to be in this beautiful space to instigate, to create a general sense of goodwill, of benevolence among the classes. So in a way, it's also targeting not only uplifting people to the same level, but it's also quelling social disorder and bringing people together so that there's this sense of social harmony. So not only is there physical harmony in the way that the units, the parts of the park are working together, but there is also social harmony among the classes in America. And finally, this notion of expertise. This Republican notion that it's not a true democracy, where the people are not the one making the decisions, recognizing the fact that there are perhaps people with greater expertise that may be more suited to make certain decisions. And that is an impulse in Olmsted's work. He intends for everyone to participate in the park. And that is something that, that continues throughout my paper, that this is meant to be inclusive, and that everyone is intended to come, regardless of whether or not people can access it, and many cannot, because, actually, ironically, because of its location, but it was intended to be open for all. And it was intended to be open for all without fear. And one of the things, he writes this in a letter to one of his friends about cowardly conservatism. And what this states is that any kind of pleasurable or cultured experience would be completely ruined by the presence of the working class, or or a group of people who would be considered uncouth. And Olmsted writes to this person, he says, Central Park is blowing this idea out of the water. That is completely ridiculous. You see people mingling in Central Park after this park opens. You see people mingling, and you see this social harmony is actually taking place. And so this idea that anything that is worth enjoying is going to be ruined by lack of manners is completely absurd. And so he is very much aware that there is this concern about whether or not the classes can mingle together and still retain a sense of order. And Olmsted says, yes, indeed they can and they should. So again, we see it's a backhanded inclusivity, very much painted, framed with this elitist attitude. Olmsted greatly admires competence, and as I mentioned a little bit in my paper, and I was telling a few people earlier that this doesn't come through in my paper perhaps to the degree that it should, but Olmsted was rather difficult to work with. And he very much had a very strict vision of what the park should be, and he strongly valued competence. And people doing what he wanted, but also doing it well. And with this feeds into this sense of expertise. And one of the things that he does is he establishes what's called the park force, the park keepers. And he calls them keepers of dignity and decency. And these are people who quite literally wander around the park, and they facilitate people's enjoyment of the park. So you have these winding paths, these beautiful groves, the ramble, the sheep meadow, all these beautiful areas where people can go. But the park keepers are there to ensure that people don't walk on the grass, that people that they aren't spitting on statues, the few that are in there, that they're not doing all these things. And so there's an enforcement of the way that the park ought to be enjoyed. And so there's, even though everyone is intended to be there, and even though there is, again, this inclusive spirit here, there's also this elitist attitude where there's a proper way to enjoy this park, and by golly, I'm going to make sure that you do. Okay. Now, a couple things that I was thinking of, I was reflecting on when reading about Olmsted. One of the things that I constantly came back to was his concern about city's impact on people. And I think it's important to remember, especially as Olmsted has such an emphasis on the way that leaders view the people whom they're serving. What impact do our environments have on other people? And looking at surroundings as an influence on people's character and on people's feelings. So looking in particular with Olmsted, what impact do cities have upon their citizens? And coming out of that, what is the extent of civic responsibility? To what extent do citizens, and even, okay, I'll go without it. I did. And even without, oh, there we go. Citizens and even leaders, what responsibility do we have to each other? What responsibility do we have each other, especially those who are given more? What responsibility do they have to people who don't have as much, who are given less? So a couple of things. And also, and this one's huge, so I will only mention it very briefly. Something that I greatly enjoyed about this project, and again, something that I especially enjoyed being in the middle of a 19th century American class at the same time, was that so many things are coming together in Olmsted's work. You see so many things about 19th century America that come together when in Olmsted's work and in Olmsted's beliefs about the park. You see things about the changing demographics of the country. You see concerns about immigration. You see the explosion of the cities. You see this search for order that Americans have always desired. This sense of bringing order to nature and of bringing things into cohesion together. This element of the frontier. You see a lot of things about 19th century America in Olmsted's work. And that is, for me, one of the most fascinating things being in senior seminar is looking at this very small subject, the creation of Central Park, and then looking at it within the framework of 19th century America. And it's very exciting to see where all the intersections are. Olmsted really is a man of his time, and you see that in his work. I included this slide in here in case there was time for questions. I see that we only have a few more minutes left.
Probably
Is there
time for maybe one real well thought out question?
Dr. Ritchie.
Matisse, but can you tell us about the modes of research that you used? Like, you talked about papers, and you obviously made a fantastic bibliography, but what were some of the interesting research methods and ways that you accessed the library?
Yes, and the library, I have never used Iliad so much in my entire life. And most of the books, actually, unfortunately, we didn't have here. One of the things that I did use is Erlene and I tracked down all 7 volumes of the Frederick Olmsted papers, and these are compilations of his papers, of letters that he wrote back and forth, and of reports about the park, and all sorts of things like that he had over the years. It covers all the way from his early, like his college years, all the way, they're still working on it. I think ultimately they're going to come up with 12 volumes, so that project is still going on. So I used tons of books. There were several compilations of his speeches that I used, and so I definitely used Iliad and ClickNet in order to track down all these compilations of his writings, because I never quite knew how much writing there was on him until I started to look, and there's tons of scholarship on this guy, and biographies as well. I actually flipped through 3 biographies of him. One of the things that I did see also is I researched a lot about Frederick Olmsted, but I also looked at the park itself, and there's been one particular very good history of Central Park. The Park and the People, I believe it's called, and that was also very helpful. There was also articles. I used a lot of articles from JSTOR, also ordering some from other libraries. Some scholarly articles, especially from 20, 30 years ago, from this reaction to this initial explosion of scholarship on Olmsted, what exactly his life was about. So the library really was the main focus of my research. Unfortunately, I didn't choose a topic in Minnesota history, otherwise I would have appreciated going down to the History Center. And I used the pictures and my memories from Central Park, from having been there last summer, also in order to inform this and thinking about, I remember that. I never was thinking about it at the time, but yes, there was the promenade, there was the open, unbroken landscape that was there, and the feelings that I had during it. I also used that. I wasn't technically researching at that time, but I definitely made use of my personal experiences as well.
We will very briefly have the handing off of the trophy ceremony from last year's winner. It was from Anthropology and Sociology Department, and Harley Schreck is representing them. Handing off to the History Department. our glorious statue
They
that
were right here, so we don't drop it. But if you want a handout, there we
Well, thank you all for coming. We'll have a 5-minute break, and then those who are in the Friends of the Library, if you could stay for our brief annual meeting, that would be very helpful. And there's still a few more goodies, especially students. Notice that there's some snacks on the way out.
Oh, sure.